February 19th, 1945. 1,000 Japanese soldiers entered the mangrove swamps of Ramree Island. By morning, only 20 emerged. The official record blames saltwater crocodiles, the largest reptilian massacre in history. But the British Marines who set the trap heard something else in the darkness that night. Not the thrashing of crocodiles, not the screams of drowning men. Something worse. They heard laughter, high-pitched, almost human, coming from throats that shouldn't exist. What the history books won't tell you is that the crocodiles were feeding on what was left behind. The real killing had already happened, and the things that did it are still there, in those swamps, waiting in the spaces between the mangrove roots where no light reaches. This is what 3 Allied soldiers witnessed, what they took to their graves. Well, what their families finally allowed to be told. This is the truth about Ramree Island. January 1945, and the war had turned in Burma. The Japanese Imperial Army was in retreat, and Ramree Island, 14 miles of mangrove swamps on the Arakan coast, stood in the way of Allied advance. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Drive the Japanese garrison south into the swamps. Let the crocodiles do the work. Artillery would waste weeks attempting. Lieutenant James Whitmore received his orders on January 26th. 5th Indian Division would execute a 3-pronged assault, pushing the enemy away from the beaches, away from evacuation, straight into the interior, where saltwater crocodiles, some 20 feet long, ruled the tidal channels. Everyone knew about the crocodiles. The briefing officer mentioned them casually, the way you mention rain in monsoon season. Most Japanese soldiers would choose the swamps over surrender. The most wouldn't survive. The assault began February 14th. By the 17th, the Japanese had been pushed back 2 miles. By the 18th, they'd abandoned their coastal positions entirely. That's when the Burmese guides refused to go further. Whitmore found them outside the command tent, arguing with Captain Morrison. The older scout, Tin Mong, looked at Whitmore with something the lieutenant had never seen in his eyes. Not fear of combat. Something older. "We do not go past the creek with the bent tree," Tin Mong said. "Not into the places where the water sings." When Whitmore pressed for explanation, the scout simply said a word in Burmese. "Nat Thami." The old things in the deep places, where the roots are thick. The other scout added something quickly. Tin Mong translated, "The Japanese are already dead, the moment they go into those places. Already dead, just don't know it yet." Morrison requisitioned different guides. Local conscripts who either didn't know the stories or needed the pay badly enough not to care. But Whitmore noticed they marked their maps carefully. Certain zones shaded in pencil, routes that avoided specific channels, even when it would have saved hours. By February 19th, the Japanese had no choice left. 1,000 men formed up in late afternoon and began their retreat into the interior. British artillery bracketed them from the north. Naval guns pounded their flanks. Every route sealed except one, south into the heart of the mangrove swamps. Whitmore watched them disappear into the mangrove line as sunset came. The jungle swallowed them in moments, and the evening went very quiet. No birds, no insects, just water moving through the channels, and something else. A high-pitched note, rhythmic, rising and falling across the tidal flats. It didn't sound like any bird Whitmore had heard in Burma. It sounded almost like laughter, distant and distorted. "Sir, are you hearing that?" Private Davies stood nearby listening. Whitmore nodded. "Probably some kind of bird, tropical species." "Doesn't sound like a bird, sir." The sound came again, closer, multiple sources, a chorus rising from deep in the mangrove darkness. Whitmore felt cold move through his chest, despite the humid heat. That night, Whitmore filed his report. Enemy forces retreating into southern interior. Expected outcome: heavy attrition from environmental factors. Wildlife hazards. Saltwater crocodiles confirmed. What he didn't include was what he'd heard. What the Burmese had warned about. What Tin Maung had called the old things in the deep places. But he marked his map with the zones the guides had avoided. And when planning patrol routes, he found himself routing around those areas without quite knowing why. The crocodiles would do their work. Everyone knew about the crocodiles. They didn't know about anything else. Lance Corporal Thomas Davies had learned to read the darkness. By midnight on February 19th, sitting in a foxhole overlooking the tidal flats, he knew something was deeply wrong. It was too quiet, not silent. That would have been better. This was the quiet that came when everything with sense had fled. No insects, no night birds, just tidal water breathing through the mangrove channels. And underneath it all, a smell. Not the standard rot of coastal swamps. This was sharper. Ammonia mixed with something organic that made his eyes water. It came in waves when the wind shifted off the interior. The sound started around 0200 hours. Screaming. You expected that when men fled into crocodile-infested swamps. But these screams were wrong, sharp, cut short. Not the prolonged agony of a crocodile death roll, but something faster, cleaner, and between the screams, something else. High-pitched, rhythmic. Davies had heard animal sounds across 3 continents. This didn't match any of them. It had a wetness to it, a gurgling quality. And it came from multiple directions, echoing across the flats. It sounded like laughter. Private Wilson called over from the next foxhole. They agreed it was probably some tropical bird, probably nothing to worry about. Neither believed it. The laughter came closer, and beneath it, something large moving through water. Not the thrashing of a crocodile. This was controlled, purposeful, multiple somethings moving in coordination. Then Davies saw them. The moon painted the mangrove line in silver and black. Shapes appeared among the roots. Tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet, impossibly thin. And they moved through the shallow water with fluid grace that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite animal. The way they bent at the joints was wrong. There were at least 3 moving in formation. One paused, perfectly still, and Davies could have sworn it was looking directly at the British positions. Looking and considering. Another moved deeper, following something, splashing, panicked, human. The laughter came again, and Davies realized it was coming from them. A hunting call. Communication. The sound rose, and the shapes responded, adjusting positions, cutting off escape routes with coordination that spoke to intelligence. Davies heard the Japanese soldier before he saw him, crashing through water, exhausted, terrified. The man stumbled into a clearing between the roots and stopped, chest heaving, turning in circles, looking everywhere except up. The thing dropped from the branches above. It happened fast. Something long and gray wrapped around the soldier from behind. Arms, they had to be arms, even if too long and bent wrong, encircled the man's chest. He was lifted off his feet, pulled backward into water, dragged under. The laughter erupted from multiple directions, excited, almost playful. Other shapes converged. The water thrashed once, briefly, then went still. Davies realized he'd stopped breathing. His hands locked on his rifle, but he hadn't fired. Every instinct screamed, "Stay still, don't draw attention, become part of darkness." The things remained for 10 minutes, moving through channels, making their sounds. Then they slipped deeper into the swampings and disappeared. The ammonia rot smell intensified, then faded with them. When Davies reported it at 0400 hours, Lieutenant Morrison listened with the expression of a man dismissing impossibilities. Combat fatigue. Stress. What Davies had seen was probably crocodiles. Large ones, perhaps hunting cooperatively. The sounds were birds or monkeys. Davies didn't argue. But when dawn patrols moved in to count Japanese dead, he volunteered immediately. The bodies weren't hard to find. 23 in the first quarter mile, all dead less than 6 hours. Crocodiles had been at some. Massive puncture wounds, crushed limbs, partially devoured torsos. But Davies noticed details that didn't match. Claw marks on several corpses, deep parallel gouges. But the spacing was wrong. Too wide for crocodile claws, more like fingers than reptilian talons. Angled downward, as if something had gripped from above and raked down. 3 bodies in trees. Not dragged by crocodiles. Crocodiles didn't climb. Wedged into branch forks 15 feet up, positioned deliberately. Stored like a leopard caching prey. Drag marks leading to water, but too narrow for crocodile belly drags. More like something bipedal had walked upright while dragging bodies. And on one muddy island, footprints. Roughly human-shaped, 5 toes, but longer, much longer, with webbing visible between toe impressions. Deep enough to suggest significant weight. Morrison called the patrol back. They'd confirmed heavy Japanese casualties. Mission accomplished. The crocodiles were doing their work. Davies looked once more at the footprints, the body in the tree, the claw marks that matched no crocodile. He thought about the shapes in water, the laughter, in the way that soldier had been plucked from the clearing. He followed the patrol back and said nothing. Official count that morning, 37 Japanese dead. Cause of death, crocodile attacks and environmental hazards. But Davies knew. Something was hunting in those swamps. Something that moved through water and trees with equal ease. Something that killed with intelligence and purpose. The crocodiles were there. The crocodiles were feeding. But they were feeding on what something else had killed. By noon on February 20th, the body count had reached 200 confirmed dead. By evening, 400. By the next morning, patrol reports suggested 800 or more. The crocodiles were being credited with the most successful hunting spree in natural history. Dr. Edmund Wright didn't believe it. Wright was a civilian naturalist, one of the foremost experts on saltwater crocodiles. He'd studied them for 15 years across 3 continents. He knew what their kills looked like. What he saw in Ramree's swamps didn't match. The first body he examined showed deep parallel lacerations running shoulder to hip, 4 of them, evenly spaced. He measured, roughly 4 inches from center to center. Wright pulled out his field journal and compared it to his crocodile notes. A typical claw spacing for even the largest saltwater crocodile. 1 to 2 inches, maybe 2.5 for an exceptional specimen. 4 inches was anatomically impossible for a crocodile. He examined 23 corpses. Same wound pattern, same impossible spacing. On the 4th, he found a handprint in dried mud next to the body. 14 inches from heel to longest toe. Roughly humanoid, 5 digits, but proportions wrong. Toes too long, spread too wide, clear webbing between them. He photographed it and made detailed measurements. At 1600 hours, Wright presented findings to Colonel Davidson. The wound patterns were inconsistent with known crocodile behavior. The spacing was wrong. The distribution suggested coordinated attacks from multiple angles, including from above. These men were killed by something with opposing thumbs, sir. Crocodiles don't have thumbs. Davidson thanked him for his thoroughness, assured him the report would be filed, and suggested tropical conditions could produce unusual predation patterns. Wright understood a dismissal when he heard one. He made 2 copies of his notes. One he submitted, the other he kept. 4 miles north, Medical Officer Harjit Singh was treating Japanese survivors brought in at dawn. 4 men, all in severe shock, all suffering massive lacerations and broken bones, all completely catatonic, staring at nothing. The wounds were wrong. Deep cuts that had somehow missed major arteries. Bone fractures suggesting massive compressive force from above. Ribs broken inward, shoulder blades cracked, spinal compression. Something had grabbed these men and squeezed while clawing. One survivor, a young private, had his right arm broken in 3 places. Too precise, too evenly spaced, as if something had gripped and twisted until bones snapped one by one. Around the breaks, Singh found distinct bruising, finger marks, 4 on top, 1 below, something with hands. At 1900 hours, the young private began seizing. Singh stabilized him, but the soldier started making sounds, high-pitched, rhythmic, almost like laughter. The sergeant in the next cot began screaming. Singh grabbed him, and when his assistant brought paper and pencil, the sergeant drew with shaking hands. A tall figure, humanoid, but wrong. Arms too long, head too large, and a mouth extending far beyond where a human jaw would end, filled with dozens of small marks representing teeth. The private died 30 seconds later, and the sergeant collapsed and never spoke again, dying 2 days later without regaining lucidity. Singh filed his report, describing wounds inconsistent with crocodile attacks and suggesting an unknown predator with grasping appendages. He attached the sergeant's drawing. The next morning, a British major politely requested all notes. Singh provided everything except the copy of the drawing he'd made and hidden in his footlocker. The radio intercepts told their own story. British signals intelligence had monitored Japanese communications all night. 3 transmissions stood out. 21:47 hours. Under attack, not from British, something in the trees. Request immediate cutoff. 23:19 hours. They are in the water. They are in the trees. They are everywhere. This is not crocodiles. They walk. They use their hands. They... Cut off. 0154 hours. February 20th. No one will believe. The crocodiles are mercy. The other things, they laugh while they... Please tell our families, not crocodiles. They think, they know. Silence. The Burmese interpreter noted that the Japanese had used the word Nattami in the last transmission. Not Japanese. Burmese, meaning water walkers. Old spirits his grandmother had warned about in the deep swamps. The note disappeared from official records. By February 22nd, the pattern was undeniable. Multiple patrols reported bodies in trees, wrong wound patterns, strange sounds, glimpses of large shapes. Radio intercepts suggested something inexplicable. A naturalist claimed crocodile predation didn't match evidence. A medic had documented impossible wounds. Colonel Davidson called a meeting of senior officers. The decision was unanimous. All deaths would be attributed to crocodile attacks and environmental hazards. Dr. Wright's report would be filed as speculative. Singh's report would be edited. Radio intercepts translated without cultural notes, and a specific zone would be marked on maps. 3 square miles in the deepest swamps. The area where unusual reports originated. The area the Burmese had warned about. Zone 7. No patrols without explicit authorization. Any reports from the area carefully reviewed. It wasn't a cover-up, Davidson insisted. It was operational security. But the men who'd been there knew. the things the Burmese called Nat Tami, the water walkers. And they knew the crocodiles were just cleaning up. Sergeant William Caulfield had survived 2 years of jungle warfare. He thought he understood Burma's horrors. Zone 7 taught him otherwise. The patrol order came at 1600 hours on February 21st. 8 men would sweep the southern interior for Japanese survivors. The area was marked in red. Extreme caution advised. Unknown hazards. They entered at 1730 hours, 90 minutes of daylight left. Caulfield had argued for dawn insertion. Command wanted intelligence quickly. The smell hit them within 100 yards. Ammonia and rot, so thick it coated throats and made eyes water. Private Chen vomited. Nobody commented. The swamp changed as they moved deeper. Mangrove roots grew denser, creating a maze where water and land blurred. The canopy thickened until only fragments of sky remained. And the sounds, the normal jungle symphony, faded to nothing. Just water. Just breathing. Just boots sucking mud. They found the first body at 1815 hours. Japanese soldier, dead 12 hours, positioned carefully in a clearing where anyone approaching would see it. 20 feet away, another soldier. This one alive. Tied upright against a tree with vines, legs missing below the knees, tourniquets keeping him from bleeding out. Eyes open but unfocused, making small broken sounds. Caulfield understood immediately. Bait. He was ordering withdrawal when the laughter started. Multiple directions at once, high-pitched and wet, echoing through channels. The sound raised every hair on Caulfield's body, triggered instincts older than civilization. Private Chen brought his rifle up. The squad formed defensive circle. Caulfield counted sources, at least 4, maybe 6, moving in pattern, surrounding them. The first one appeared in fading light, roughly humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, bipedal, but proportions nightmarishly wrong. 7 feet tall, impossibly emaciated, all long limbs and prominent joints. Skin grayish-green, wet leather texture, semi-translucent where firelight caught it. The head was worst, elongated, too large for the body, eyes huge and black, no whites, reflecting light wrong. And the mouth. God, the mouth extended far beyond where any human jaw would end. A wide gash splitting the face nearly to where ears should be, filled with multiple rows of needle-thin teeth. It stood watching them with undeniable intelligence, not animal instinct. This thing was thinking, considering, deciding. Then it smiled. The mouth stretched impossibly wide, but when Caulfield realized the laughter wasn't coming from its mouth. Throat sacs inflated on either side of its neck, membranes vibrating to produce that terrible sound. Williams fired first, 3-round burst, center mass. The thing moved before the trigger pull completed, faster than anything that size should move. The rounds buried themselves in a tree. The laughter intensified. 3 more emerged from channels, positioning themselves, cutting off escape routes, coordinating without visible communication. Pack hunters, intelligent pack hunters. Caulfield ordered concentrated fire. 6 rifles opened up, 40 rounds in 3 seconds. The thing jerked as bullets found it, dark fluid spraying. It went down and got back up. The laughter changed pitch. The things attacked. They came from 3 directions, moving through water and over roots with terrifying speed. One dropped from above. Caulfield hadn't seen it climb, and landed on Chen. Those long arms wrapped around him and squeezed. Ribs cracked like green wood. Chen's breath exploded out. The thing dragged him into water. Williams and Corporal Davies put 15 rounds into it. It stumbled, released Chen, turned toward them with that impossible mouth. Chen crawled away, both arms broken, chest crushed. Another one emerged from the channel behind him and took him, grabbed his ankles and pulled him under. The water thrashed once, went still. The patrol fell apart. Training said maintain formation, but training was written by men who'd never faced this. The squad scattered. Caulfield tried to keep them together, but the things were everywhere. Water, trees, and darkness. Moving with coordination that spoke to intelligence and something that might have been joy. Williams went down, wrapped by something beneath the surface. Davies lifted off the ground by arms, reaching from above. Jenkins screaming, screams cutting off with wet crunch. 4 men dead in 3 minutes. Caulfield crashed through the swamp, rifle empty, just running. The laughter followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always multiple sources. They were hurting him. They could have taken him a dozen times. They were playing. He stumbled into a channel, went under, surfaced gasping in a small pool surrounded by roots. Dead end. He turned and saw it standing there, watching. Bigger than the others. 8 feet tall, scars across its torso. It tilted its head in a disturbingly human gesture, almost curious, and the throat sacs inflated slowly, producing softer sound, not laughter now. Almost like speech, almost like it was trying to communicate. Caulfield stopped moving. Every instinct screamed, run, fight, something. But his body had made a decision. He stood perfectly still, water to his waist. It took a step closer. Those huge black eyes never left his face. Caulfield could smell it. Ammonia and rot and something underneath like salt and deep water. The thing reached out one impossibly long arm. Caulfield realized he was about to die. The fingers touched his chest, gently. The claws, curved and sharp, rested against his uniform without breaking fabric. The thing leaned closer. Caulfield could see his reflection in those black eyes, could see multiple rows of teeth, could feel warm breath that smelled like rotting fish. It pushed him, not hard, just firm. Backward, toward the pool's edge, toward shore, toward escape. And Caulfield understood. This thing could kill him any time. It was choosing not to. It wanted him to leave, to survive, to tell the story. The thing made that almost speech sound and pushed again, harder. Caulfield stumbled backward, found footing, started moving. The thing watched, made no move to follow. In the darkness around the pool, other shapes watched, other black eyes. All watching, all letting him go. He made it back to British lines at 21:45 hours. Alone, covered in mud and blood, most not his. 8 men had entered Zone 7. 1 returned. Davidson asked what happened. Caulfield told him about the things in the swamp, the tall gray creatures, the pack coordination, the intelligence in those eyes, the way they'd let him go. Davidson told him to get sleep, and that combat fatigue was understandable. But Caulfield saw the colonel's hands shake, saw the look that said he believed every word but could never admit it. That night, listening to distant sounds, might be wind, might be laughter, Caulfield understood something else. They weren't just hunting Japanese. They were hunting anyone who entered their territory. British, Japanese didn't matter. Intruders in a place that belonged to something older. And the things in Zone 7 wanted everyone to know it. Wanted survivors to spread the word. Wanted the fear. Because fear kept people away. Caulfield never entered Zone 7 again. Command issued standing orders. Avoid the area. Mark it contaminated. Attribute deaths to crocodiles. The war moved on. The airbase was built. Zone 7 was forgotten in official records. But the men who'd been there remembered. Was the laughter, the shapes, the intelligence in those black eyes. They remembered being chosen, being messengers. And they never forgot that somewhere in those swamps, something was still hunting, still watching, still waiting. The three men who saw the most carried their knowledge in different ways. Lance Corporal Thomas Davies returned to England in late 1945. Married, found work, had children. But his wife said he never slept through a full night. Every night he'd wake gasping, talking about things in the water, things that laughed. He refused to go near rivers, wouldn't swim. When his daughter asked why, he said he'd seen enough water in Burma to last a lifetime. 3 days before his death in 1989, Davies asked his grandson to bring a tape recorder. For 47 minutes, he described Ramree Island, the shapes, the laughter, the bodies in trees, the webbed footprints. "They let us live," he said. "They could have killed every man on that island, but they chose not to. They wanted us to know they were there, wanted us to be afraid. And God help me, I've been afraid every day since." The tape sat in an archive until 2019, when a researcher recognized its significance. Medical officer Harjit Singh returned to India, became a civilian doctor, kept the hidden notes for 50 years. In 1995, shortly before his death, he gave them to his eldest son with instructions: wait 20 years, then release them. The notes became public in 2015. Detailed anatomical drawings of wound patterns, measurements proving crocodile attacks impossible, clinical assessment, injuries caused by large bipedal predator with grasping hands, and the drawing, the crude sketch by the dying Japanese sergeant. Tall humanoid figure, arms too long, head too large, mouth extending past human jaw, filled with teeth. Sergeant William Caulfield remained in the military, rose to major, served with distinction. In 1952, where he wrote a classified report at military intelligence's request. 17 pages. Everything he'd witnessed in Zone 7. The coordinated pack hunting, the physical characteristics, the intelligence, the deliberate choice to let him survive. Final recommendation: permanent exclusion of the designated area. These entities pose significant threat to any personnel entering their territory. They demonstrate problem-solving capabilities, coordinated group behavior, and possible tool use. Engagement not advised. Stamped, assessed, and dismissed. Combat-related stress disorder. Declassified in 1998. But Caulfield wrote one more document. A personal letter, April 2003, 2 months before his death at 84. Unsealed upon death, made public in 2020. He described the moment the entity touched his chest, when those black eyes met his, and when he understood he was being examined by something that thought and reasoned and chose. "It wanted me to remember," he wrote, "to tell others, to spread the fear, because fear kept people away from their territory. I've spent my life wondering if I did right by staying silent. Perhaps they're still there because we pretended they weren't." The letter concluded with coordinates, the exact location of Zone 7. The evidence didn't end with witnesses. Dr. Wright's photographs showed unusual footprints, wound patterns, bodies placed in trees. His tissue analysis described samples from skin fragments on a Japanese bayonet. Aquatic in origin, cellular structures inconsistent with known reptilian, mammalian, or amphibian classification. The samples were stored in the British Museum. In 1947, a fire destroyed 40% of Pacific Theater specimens. Wright's samples were among the losses. Only his written analysis survived. Japanese survivor journals, discovered decades later, described the same things. One entry, February 21st. The tall things came from the water last night. They move like men, but are not men. Hayashi shot one 4 times. It did not die. The laughing never stops. The Burmese folklore provided deepest context. Nat Thami, water walkers, appeared in mythology dating back 2,000 years. Tall gray spirits inhabiting deepest mangrove parts, emerging at night to hunt intruders. They had voices mimicking human sounds to lure prey. They hunted in groups. They had hands that could grasp and tear. They were intelligent, capable of setting traps and remembering faces. Local villages maintained taboo zones marked by crude shrines with offerings. Fish, rice, sometimes blood, meant to appease the Nat Thami, to acknowledge their territory. The British and Japanese in 1945 had entered those zones without knowledge or permission. But the most disturbing evidence is modern. In 2024, Myanmar's political instability reduced patrols. Illegal logging crews began entering restricted zones. Over 18 months, 12 men disappeared from camps near old Zone 7 boundaries. 20 more reported missing by families. Survivors described things in the trees, shapes moving through water at dusk, sounds like laughter. And for the first time in decades, sightings outside traditional Nat Thami territory. Adjacent islands, coastal areas safe for generations, as if something was expanding its range, as if environmental pressure, rising seas, depleted fish stocks, was pushing them into new areas. The singing waters weren't just in Zone 7 anymore. They were spreading. For 900 Japanese families, Ramri Island wasn't a footnote. It was sons, fathers, brothers listed as killed in action, with no bodies, no details. Just a location and silence. Some families heard different stories, whispered accounts from the 20 survivors who returned. Stories about things that weren't crocodiles. Things that hunted like men but moved like nightmares. Things that laughed. In 2019, a researcher met Kenji Yamamoto, son of a Ramri survivor. His father had spoken only once about it, weeks before his 1994 death. What he described matched British accounts. The tall gray figures, the coordinated hunting, the intelligence, the laughter. But he'd added something. The crocodiles were a mercy, he'd said. They ended suffering quickly. The other things made you understand you were prey and that you were in their world now. When asked if he believed it, Yamamoto didn't hesitate. My father was an engineer, not given to fantasy. If he said he saw these things, he saw them. The uncomfortable truth about Ramri is this. The British knew the Japanese were retreating into dangerous terrain. They knew about the crocodiles. Some heard Burmese warnings about other things. And they drove the Japanese forward anyway, using artillery to eliminate every escape route except the one leading into the swamps. Calculated tactics, sound military strategy. But from a moral standpoint, something else. The witnesses, Davies, Caulfield, Whitmore, carried that weight. They'd seen what waited. They'd learned too late that crocodiles were the least danger. They understood they'd driven men towards something far worse than combat death. Caulfield's final letter addressed this. We knew something was wrong. The guides told us. The sounds told us. The bodies told us. But we classified everything as natural hazards because the alternative was too impossible. And so men kept entering those swamps. All of them walking into territory of something that had every right to defend its home. That last line was key. The entities weren't monsters. They were indigenous species defending territory from invasion. The real invasion wasn't Japanese fleeing British forces. It was humans, any humans, entering an ecosystem that had evolved in isolation for millennia. From that perspective, 1945 wasn't senseless violence. It was territorial response. The Nat Thami had coexisted around the edges for thousands of years, as long as boundaries were respected. And the war brought too many humans too deep, and they responded with overwhelming force and just enough mercy, letting witnesses survive to ensure the message spread. Stay out, respect the borders, or face consequences. For 79 years mostly, people listened. Zone 7 stayed avoided. Locals stayed away from Singing Waters. But in 2024, that border began failing. Climate change altered Ramri's ecosystem. Rising seas changed salinity. Warming waters depleted fish populations. Coastal development reduced habitat. And desperate humans entered areas avoided for generations. 12 men disappeared in 18 months. Survivors described the same things witnesses described for 80 years. And now, increasingly, sightings in areas where they'd never been reported. The entities that remained in their channels for millennia are moving. Whether from environmental necessity or population pressure or decision to reclaim territory, no one knows. But the pattern is clear. The borders that protected humans for generations are no longer holding. The Nat Thami do not share territory. They do not forgive intrusion, and they do not forget. The question haunting everyone who studies Ramri is what comes next. Continued expansion until conflict becomes unavoidable? Adaptation to human presence? Or what apex predators typically do when territory is threatened, defend with escalating violence? No one knows. What is known? Something lives in the deep mangrove channels. Something that evolved in isolation, developed intelligence and coordinated hunting, established territory defended for thousands of years. Something that killed at least 900 men in February 1945, and dozens more since. Something that, if 2024 reports are accurate, is no longer staying in traditional territory. February 19th, 1945. 1,000 Japanese soldiers entered the mangrove swamps of Ramri Island. By morning, only 20 emerged. History records it as a crocodile attack, the largest of its kind. A footnote in the Pacific War, a grim curiosity about nature's indifference to human conflict. But the men who set that trap, who heard the sounds in darkness, who saw what came for those soldiers, they carried a different truth. A truth about something older than the war, older than empires. Something that had claimed those swamps long before humans drew borders or gave names to islands. The British soldiers who witnessed it are gone now. The Japanese survivors are gone. The Burmese guides who warned them are gone. All took their knowledge to graves scattered across 3 continents. But the mangrove swamps of Ramri Island remain, quiet during the day, alive with different sounds at night. And on certain evenings, when the tide is right and the moon is down, fishermen still hear it. That sound, high-pitched, rhythmic, rising from channels where no light reaches. The Singing Waters. They remember what their grandparents told them, what the Burmese have whispered for 2,000 years. The crocodiles are not the old things in those swamps. They are the young things. They came after. The Nat Thami aren't the only things soldiers have encountered in forgotten places. If you want to hear what else is out there, subscribe and hit the bell. Some stories should never be forgotten.